This channel is part of the History Hit network.
This is Aston Eyre Farmhouse in the heart of Shropshire. Now you might think it looks like any other typical English farmhouse, but what's that great archway doing over the front door? Well, originally this farmhouse was a gatehouse, and the archway was an opening which led across to that medieval hall, across that big courtyard, and over there a whole complex of other old buildings. Somewhere in this jumble of remains lies a unique picture of medieval life, and Time Team have got just 3 days to unearth it. You're pretty excited about this weekend, aren't you?
Yeah, I like buildings. I like looking at them, yeah.
But there's loads of medieval architecture all over the country. What's so special about this?
Yeah, well, usually it's either lived in or used, but this is derelict, and it doesn't look as if much has happened to it for perhaps the last couple of 100 years. So it's sitting here like a fossil. And because it's been altered time and time again, you see all these patches of brick in it,
Yeah.
and infilled doorways and so on. Buildings are really like underground archaeology. You can read them in the same way. Whereas, you know, in underground you've got a pit, cut through a ditch, cut through a wall and so on. You can disentangle that. Buildings are just the same. You've got bits that have been added, bits taken away, bits filled in.
Yeah, because I always think of archaeology as being something from under the ground, but this is up in the air archaeology.
It's sorting out the physical evidence, you know, and that's what we're doing here.
So the majority of the work that we'll do this weekend will be on this building and in the courtyard?
Yeah, but I mean, we think the whole thing had a moat around it, and there are lots of buildings missing. I mean, if the obvious one is the kitchen, because there would have been a detached kitchen, there would have been outbuildings. So we're going to do the geophysics, and we've got a whole series of evaluation trenches to put in against the building and around it, to put it in its context, really.
Oh, presumably this building of this size wouldn't have been here in isolation.
Oh, no. I mean, there's the gatehouse over there, there's the medieval church over there, but there probably was a village as well. And, you know, it sits in the middle of its fields. It's part of a sort of local community, and we'll try and put it into its context.
The Great Hall is where the lord of the manor dined with his family and friends. This weekend is the only chance to investigate the whole site before the builders move in, because the owner, Neil Dalton, wants to restore it as a luxury home.
Well, yes, when Neil originally applied for his planning permission, we did an archaeological evaluation, but it just basically scratched the surface, and so has left us the opportunity now to find out what the site's really about.
And what date is this building?
Well, it's obviously medieval. People have published opinions of the 13th century, the 14th century, even the 15th century. But there are a number of points in this particular building, this particular room, which we can see. For example, a window up there, which has got its original 15th century tracery in it. Perhaps the best clue of all is the structure over in the corner there, that rather fine archway. Perhaps we should go and have a better look at it outside.
Okay.
Mark thinks the arch is 100 years older than the window. Seems a bit of a jumble to me. We need to work out how the 14th and 15th century bits of architecture fit together, and how features like the archway might have looked.
And in front of it, there would have been a great glazed window, which is known as an oriel window, that provided light, like the Lord's table.
What do you mean in
the hall.
front of it?
Well, roughly here, you can see the scar of the wall on the side of the building here that would have ran across here, and so the glass would be where I'm standing
So
here.
it'd be almost like a little conservatory?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the wall would have returned back somewhere, we don't know, back to the side of the hall.
You've already done an evaluation trench here, Mark, haven't you?
Yes, well, we found 3 stones, rather unimpressively, which return back to the side of the building, and we interpret this as the end wall of the oriel. If you look carefully, you could just see a sort of, with an eye of faith, a line against the wall there.
But these 3 stones, what, were they running straight down the middle of the trench, were they?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I would have thought, Phil, that we need to open a much bigger area up round here, don't you?
From here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
So that the trench would come out?
yeah, and then
Yeah.
back across
Through
with this,
Mark's
Phil,
trench? When
Yeah,
did you
yeah.
dig this trench, Mark?
Last year.
and then back over the wall this way, I'd have thought, because you can see the ragged area up there, so we ought to be somewhere back where the window is.
And if we find that the base of this oriel ties in with the oldest phase of this building, then that means that...
We have a very early oriel. Well, we'd better
And more importantly, that will also give us a medieval date for a large chunk of the main hall.
History Hit is like Netflix, just for history fans. With exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. With familiar faces such as Dan Jones and Dr. Eleanor Yanega, we've got hundreds of documentaries covering the greatest figures and events of medieval history. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code CHRONICLE at checkout.
Throughout this weekend, we're going to be on the hunt for all the bits and pieces that go back that early. One of the key parts of a medieval manor was the gatehouse entrance, with perhaps a moat and drawbridge.
When she got married.
Beric Morley, our buildings expert, is keen to get a look at a piece of medieval architecture that survived, buried inside a much later building.
So we're in the gatehouse passage here,
That's
aren't we?
right.
Upstairs. And this must have been the front of the gatehouse with doors closing into this rebate here.
Well, that's right. Well, these hinges were always pointed
Oh,
out to
well,
me.
that's right.
One
They're
of the things that...
amazing.
That's right.
Yeah, they're
How
so
they
big,
remain.
pintles we tend to call them. And there's one, the other side, these are the top ones, another pair below, taking great big heavy wooden oak doors. And that's
Yes.
the arch of the gateway opening through into the manor courtyard and across to the hall.
As well as the stonework, there's masses of timber in all of the buildings which may give us dates for the different parts.
Okay, give it a whack.
If there are original beams beneath these floorboards, Mick and Beric hope they'll provide good samples for tree ring dating expert Dan Miles.
Oh yes, these are really good sized beams. These big timbers certainly look as if they could well have survived since
Yeah.
the medieval period.
Okay, well, we'd like you to look at these, see if you can get a core and a date out of this, but I'd like you to look at the solar as well in the main building, because I think there's similar floor timbers there. What would be lovely if they were the same date.
Keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, we better let you get on with it, I think. Start drilling.
The pattern of the tree rings in each core is the key to the age of the beam. If Dan can get a date from one of them, it should tell us when the gatehouse was constructed. But to relate it to the other buildings, he'll need to do the same in the Great Hall and Solar Wing, which is the Lord's private apartment next to it. We think there were other medieval buildings here too, so the first task for the geophysics team is to find them.
John, where are you off to now?
Going to go into the courtyard.
Ah, right. You might like to know before you start there some of the, I mean, it looks open at the moment. I mean, it is open at the moment,
Yes.
but it's actually, there have been quite a lot of other buildings there. I think there's this watercolour of 1789 which shows a building in there. That's the gable end of the main hall, and that building may lie along there.
How recently were the buildings there?
Well, there's an air photograph here from 1971, and you can see they're still there then, and there's even some other buildings in there as well at that date.
That's going to make things difficult.
While we clear the ground for our first trench by the Oriel, geophysics are surveying the main courtyard. Round the back of the hall, we found a ditch which could be part of a medieval moat. There's a mill mentioned in the Domesday Book, and Stuart thinks there may be a medieval village here too. And in the Great Hall, there are more timbers for Dan to sample, while Victor imagines how it might have looked in the 14th or 15th century. In the trench at the front of the hall, Phil's already uncovered some big foundation stones.
Hello, look, Mark. What do you think of that?
I thought we ought to lay our tape out, the trench out. Now we've...
Well, look.
My gosh,
We're
that's
just-
sandstone, isn't it?
Yeah, and look at it. It's bang on the line where you said you wanted it to
Yeah.
be. And look at it. It's diving right in underneath. So
And it's-
this whole arch with this is sitting on top of that.
That foundation.
So if that arch is original,
that's original.
that's got to be original.
Yeah, spot on.
So the oriel was part of the earliest phase of the building. Behind the main hall, there's a second courtyard where Carenza thinks she's found an important part of the medieval plumbing, a culvert which brought fresh water into the manor.
If we can clean out this culvert, have a look at it within the building, that'll tell us whether it did come right through it. And it then must have run off down this way. And we need to get all this cleared up, obviously. But once we've done that, we might be able to find footings of other buildings and see whether there's any bits of the culvert that join in at all to other avenues that might tell us there are other buildings here.
A network of water.
Yes, yeah, it would tell us whether there were buildings here, whether it was open. Of course, we do know that it was running down this way, probably back into the moat, and picking up the sewage from the garderobe on the way through there, which is...
What, this building?
That's right, yes, which is there, basically.
Over here?
Yeah, it's actually the doorway up there, just
That
leading
there?
to it. That's right, yes.
And what is a garderobe?
Basically, that's the Lord's private loo. So if we can find out how the water flowed through this site, we could envisage perhaps that's a kitchen block where the water's coming in for cooking, and maybe there's other blocks, other buildings here that maybe it's used for washing or something. Then the last thing it does before it goes back into the moat is pick up the sewage.
So the moat would have been pretty fetid, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
The doorway to the garderobe leads off the solar, the Lord's private apartment, which was reached by the staircase from the oriel.
Because if we were the Lord or members of his close family, this is where we live.
Well, it's not very salubrious, is it?
Oh, well, yes, it may not be now, but at one time it had, I've no doubt it had hangings on the wall, it had a fancy roof to match that in the hall, and that big window over that end, which you can see from the gatehouse, that's 2/3 of this space. Then there's a partition, and beyond that, our own private bedchambers, and beyond that, the garderobe, the private loo.
It is hard to imagine that this was once the swankiest part of the whole building, isn't
Oh,
it?
but it was very grand.
One of the most important things we want to find out this weekend is who lived here. So I've gone to meet Paul Stamper, an archaeologist who also knows the local history.
Do we know who built this church?
We do. It was the first of 3 families who were intimately involved with Aston Eyre in the early Middle Ages. The church was built by a man called Robert Fitzeyre, from whom the village takes its name. And we've actually got a copy here of a deed by which in 1138-1140, Robert Fitzeyre actually endows the church. And then if we look at the tympanum...
Well, this is a bit good, isn't it?
Wonderful tympanum showing Christ entering Jerusalem on an ass.
And what sort of year is it?
Well, again, it's about 1140, and this is the second piece of evidence of the church having been established at this time.
So the Fitzeyres built the church and presumably the manor house?
Well, not the manor house as we see it. That's a bit later. That seems to coincide with the time when, in the early 14th century, the last of the Fitzeyre lords of the manor dies, leaving as an heiress Marjorie. And she's married off to a very powerful man called Alan of Charlton. And it seems at the moment that it was during their marriage that house was built.
So some of the bits of medieval architecture we've been looking at could be the remains of the house that Alan de Charlton built when he married Marjorie Fitzeyre in the mid-14th century. Steve's spending the weekend working on a 3D model of the whole manor. He'll mark in the key bits of medieval fabric as we work out the dates for them. Medieval stone buildings were rendered with lime mortar, and Mick's going to try and make some this weekend. Normally it would take weeks, but with the help of Ian Pritchett, he's hoping to do it in 2 days.
Now, can you explain to me very simply what the process involves? Because I come across lime kilns all over the place, you know, and they all seem to be different. So how does it actually work?
Well, basically, it's taking limestone, heating it in a kiln or simple clamp.
Yeah, we've got bags of limestone, haven't we?
We have, yes.
And it does occur locally, doesn't it? In Wenlock Edge and
Wenlock
like
Edge,
that.
limestone occurs over most areas in the country.
Yeah.
This is it, straightforward, simple limestone. We're going to heat it up in this kiln. We'll have a fire in this box here.
Right.
And then the limestone is stacked on top of here in such a way that when the wicker burns away, this forms a self-supporting arch.
Oh, right.
And then we keep stoking the fire for a period of 12 to 15, 18 hours. And providing we keep the temperature up above 900 degrees centigrade,
Yeah.
this will change from being limestone to quicklime.
We've cleared the culvert now, and as Carenza thought, it does run through this building, which might be the kitchen, into the inner courtyard. But we still don't know where the water came from, either a diverted stream or the moat.
We know a lot about medieval water control systems in various buildings, but it's usually monasteries. But it's very unusual in domestic buildings, in secular buildings, of which this is one. And I don't understand why they should have done this, because it's too elaborate.
So for some reason,
Yeah,
this has got much swankier plumbing than it should have.
it's very, very odd. But we've been debating for a little while now about whether we're going to put some trenches in with a machine across the likely lines of a moat or ponds around the site. But we might actually argue now that we should put one across here and tie whatever this is up with the water system.
4 o'clock day one, and apparently we've hit a problem. What's up, Phil?
Well, a bit unexpected, really. We've got this rather nice brick yard surface.
Which presumably isn't medieval.
No, it's definitely not medieval. And, well, being archaeologists, we've obviously got to record it.
So you're going to have to photograph this,
Yep.
draw the bricks,
Yep.
and only then will you be able to get rid of them and dig
I
down.
mean, don't make a big issue of it. I mean, it'll take time, but not that much time. I mean, we've got it underway. Planning is being done now, and we've got as much as we can. Obviously, lifting it is going to be a piece of cake.
Wasn't
So-
it typical time team, isn't it? You would have thought this was the simplest task that we'd got to do, just dig down a few feet, and we found a whole brick floor. It's like a kind of wall on its side. Well, how long? Hour?
Meanwhile, Berwick's trying to unravel another puzzle in the masonry.
A couple of enigmatic bits of stonework I wanted to ask
Yes.
you about. The first is round both these buildings there seem to be the same mason's mark on several bits of stone. There's one there.
Oh yes, that's
Look.
a sort of Z.
That's
reversed N if you look at it that
whatever,
way. Yes.
I mean, it's there, the same mark up on top
Yes.
of the arch. There's one down here, look, on
Oh,
the
yeah.
doorway. And then one on the solar building right across there. You
Oh,
can see
yes.
it's showing
Yes.
very clearly.
Yes.
So what sort of date do you think they are?
Well, they're quite firmly cut, and I think that would span the sort of dates that we're talking about here, the 14th and 15th century. If they were earlier, I think they'd be much lighter cut, and if they were very much later in the 16th century, they'd be much more complicated than that.
And it's looking complicated by the guardrobe as well. Where we'd hoped to find the foundations, all we've got so far is a cobbled floor. And the only sign of a medieval water channel is this puddle. At least the lime kiln's working, but it's nowhere near hot enough yet. It's got to reach 900 degrees and stay there till well into tomorrow. Otherwise we won't get the quicklime for our medieval mortar.
So it's the end of day one, and at last we've managed to get this brick course off of trench one. Phil, how's it going?
Well, look, we've got enormous big stones sitting in the natural clay. And look what else we've got. Our first piece of medieval pottery. 13th to 14th century.
A find. We've actually got
What do you think of
our
that?
first find. Very good. Berwick, what do we know about the date of the medieval hall?
Well, we already know it's 15th century in its latter form, and what we now know is the roof that's missing we can reconstruct, because in the gatehouse, reused much later, is part of the timbers from that roof. It's only one timber, but it's such an important timber, it'll enable us to reconstruct the whole roof.
And can we
Amazing.
date the gatehouse yet?
Well, we can, because that tree ring dating that we started this morning, the results have come through, and we've got a date that's between 1332 and 1362.
That's fantastic. That's actually the right sort of date for when Alan de Charlton married into the family, which is when we think the whole building was rebuilt. That would fit with that.
So we've got the history beginning to tie in with the
Well, just
archaeology.
for once,
Yeah.
yes.
And what about the moat?
Well, we've got the geophysics results, the resistance, and there's a very low resistance area across the end of this building where you and I were talking about where there might be a moat. So I think tomorrow we do actually put a trench across there and see if we've actually got the profile of the moat in there.
That would be great, because I mean we're looking around the back of the main hall here. We've got the culvert. We think we may have it coming through, and we're hoping we may find the remains of the garderobe as well. But what we really need to know is much more about, was the remote, where did it go, how did the water come into the site, how did it get out of the site? We need to get all that done, the excavation and the survey for that.
So it's really tantalising. We've got all these little snapshots of what life was like around here over a period of about 3 centuries. The old house, the roof of the hall, the little piece of pottery, the mystery in the trench. But what we haven't yet got is the big picture. And let's hope that it starts to come into focus tomorrow. See you after the break.
Day 2, and we've started a second trench in the main courtyard. Hopefully this will find the moat, and it should uncover some of the buildings on the old maps and plans. These timbers have come out of the ground floor room beneath the solar, where we found another cobbled floor which could be medieval. And Dan's hoping to repeat yesterday's success in the gatehouse with these beams in the ceiling. Just across the road, Stuart's found a series of shallow dips, which are all that remain of a medieval fish farm belonging to the manor.
There's a good story about water management. It can't survive without water, and water's part of its economy, it's part of its sustenance. And what we've got is, the manor house is there.
Where are we?
We're here, where these ponds are. This is the main streams coming down here and here. And water's being diverted off into the fish ponds where we are. And it may be that the hall itself is sited here because of the water situation.
So the water came down here.
Yeah.
And it lands up in the moat in the manor complex just beyond where the church is.
Yeah, I'm a bit uneasy about using this term moat at the moment.
But everyone's assumed that they've said there's a moat there, haven't they?
I think the basis for that is that moats, if there's a wet ditch, there's always an assumption it's a moat, and people think of that as a defensive feature. In the early 14th century, houses are starting to become more display type features. You're making a statement about how wealthy you are and how important you are.
And Mick was saying that culvert is actually really very high class. Looks like something you would associate more with a monastery. So it looks like they were throwing quite a few bob at this house.
I would think so. The whole water management scheme here looks quite complex.
This is the roof beam from the Great Hall, which Berwick spotted yesterday. It's been reused in a later chimney breast in the gatehouse.
It is wonderful, but it's beautifully cut. And it's cut not for a fireplace like this, but for somewhere where it stood out in the open.
Oh,
you
right.
feel round, because not only you've got a moulding this side on what's now the front, run your hand back and you'll find it.
Dan's torch,
Yep, you'll find the moulding runs right the way around the back as well.
Right, so they wouldn't have done that not to see it, would they?
This comes from a whopping great big roof.
It looks like nothing on earth, doesn't it?
Well,
with all this black gunge all over it.
Well, the black gunge is important because it's all over it.
Yeah.
Not just from this fire, but earlier on, right out here, there's smoke blackening. And so it must have been in a big building with an open fire inside it.
So this is a timber up in the roof that's picking up all the smoke going through, right?
And there's more yet. The curving form of it comes down as a collar high up in the roof, and that curve would be continued down by another piece of timber that brought it right down to the wall head.
Right.
And we've got a bit of that other timber.
Right.
Here it is, look.
Yeah.
It follows the curve.
It's jointed in.
But it's jointed in. And I've actually done a little drawing. It's only a rough sketch, but
right. So we can see how that fits into the whole roof. And of course it's at that angle now, isn't it, with the flat top?
That's right. And we've got Victor already doing a reconstruction of that, so people can see what it looks like.
The other thing is, we're going to be able to get a dendro date out of that.
Well, there is a
piece
problem.
of timber.
The rings on this are a bit wide and possibly not showing the variation that they ought.
Right, but, so we haven't got enough rings really to fit it into a sequence.
No, we haven't, but we're actually fortunate in that the shape of this roof, with a large gap between the two arches, is something that is fairly common here in the early part of the 15th century.
Right, so we're going to use stylistic grounds rather than that date.
If the beam is from a 15th century roof of the hall, it's 100 years later than the solar and the oriel. It seems there are 14th and 15th century elements muddled right through this building.
Steeper pitch to the roof, perhaps. Slightly moulded undersides.
But our second trench hasn't found a moat as we'd expected, just the remains of a Victorian shed. And in the inner courtyard, progress is slow as well. We're still looking for the water channel running down from the culvert, but the cobble floors covered everything.
It's the middle of day 2 and we're back where we started, in front of the Gatehouse. Now, up until now, everyone has assumed that there would have been a moat round here originally, until Stuart said he wasn't sure that there was. John, John, you've geophysicked in, haven't you?
Yes.
Have we got any evidence of the moat?
Whoa,
Whoa, what does that mean?
Well, I've got you a pipe.
This is just an ordinary service pipe?
Just an ordinary service pipe.
That thing there.
So that's that thing there.
Yeah.
What we've got of interest to the side is a broad band of high readings, which could be a roadway, a track. But the problem is, it doesn't line up with the arch. Now, there's a hint in the readings that might just be the edge of a moat.
So, shall we put a trench in and find out what's going on?
I think we've got to. I mean, it's, you know, we thought about putting one here anyway, outside the front of the gatehouse.
Yeah. Well, you're not going to be able to dig in there now because of the pipe, are you?
Yeah.
Nick?
No.
Sorry, can I intervene? If we put a trench here, we won't be able to relate the archaeology to the building.
Yeah.
Because the building is the only bit that we know is medieval, don't we? Whereas if we put a trench away from the building, we're going to lose the archaeological relationship.
But we can't really get close to the building because of the garden and the path.
Well, we could ask the owner. I mean,
We could, yeah. I mean, I just assumed we couldn't dig across the path.
No, I don't think there's any problem.
Right.
There's no inhabitant. We'll put it back tomorrow morning.
So, in other words, we take the trench that we've laid out
right
here and
across.
just extend it right to the building.
Yes, we need to relate probably to the medieval building. I don't know where you've lined the trench.
Well, we've got a problem with a pipe, Mark.
Coming out of the front
Or
door.
what looks like a pipe on the geophysics, a water pipe or something like
Right.
that. Which you know is right where we don't want it because it's right up against the front of the.
We can avoid that. We can avoid that with digging. That's no problem. Dig around it.
So you reckon we could extend this trench, which is currently just going down to here, to the new extension of the old gatehouse?
Yeah, but we can't get to the house, can we? Because we've got this path and garden in the way.
Well, why the hell not?
Well, because the owner presumably won't.
This is the sort of conversation that goes on in Time Teams for hour after hour after hour.
Yeah, look, I know.
As it's lunchtime, I think we ought to have this debate over lunch and then sort it out
in order for us to.
around about 2 o'clock.
Lunch. Otherwise, we can't relate the archaeology.
Well, you look at what John's got.
This will answer the question.
Yeah, bring
A simple trench.
We've got permission to put our new trench in right up to the front of the gatehouse. There's a lot to record this weekend, and taking photographs of the building will speed up the process. The pictures will have all the perspective errors taken out of them, so Sue can use them to make an accurate scale drawing of each bit of wall. The drawing makes it easier to see the different phases of construction, and that will help Berwick catalogue all the alterations to it over the centuries. In the main courtyard, Phil's found part of a medieval jug handle. From the helicopter, I can see how the springs and streams which come down from the ridge affect the layout of the whole manor.
So we're coming down where the springs were now.
And I can see Stuart's ranging poles ahead there.
Yeah, well, once they get to the edge of the village, they've obviously diverted them into some fish ponds. Put little dams across the valley, made some little tanks. They're dry now, you know, it's just grass, but you can see he's marked them out for us. And they would have kept, you know, tench and bream and perhaps pike and so on in there to help, you know, supplement the diet, really. And then just below that, we've got the road, probably with more village. You see the earthworks along the road.
This is an old road, is it?
It looks like it, the way it's sunk in. Over the church, which you know is about 1150, was a chapel for much of its history. And then we come to the manor complex.
With the water still going downhill?
Yeah, well, it's coming through a spring in the corner there, and then through our conduit over there, and under the back of the buildings. And then, you know, we don't know yet whether there's a moat round the back here, taking the overflow from the springs.
And then it goes off down into the stream down there?
Down the bottom there.
At last, we seem to be getting somewhere in Trench 2.
Oh God, you've got a lot more's come out there, hasn't it?
This is getting really interesting here, Carenza. Look, we've got what looks like a front wall to a building,
Right.
of which that is the back wall.
When I was here earlier, we were right up at the top of the track,
That's
and that was
right.
building 18.
That's right.
So we're now down at this 19/23 one. 23, the evidence for that actually comes from this watercolour, which was done in 1789. So if we reckon that most of this is 18th and 19th century, if there is anything medieval below it, how long do you think it's going to take you to get down to it?
We got a lot of work to do, yeah. I think it's going to be well into the afternoon.
I still feel I don't know much about what life was like here for the Charlton family in the 14th century, but Paul's managed to find out a bit more.
Marjorie Fitzeyre is a wealthy local heiress, and she marries Alan of Charlton in the late 1330s. They have a son, Thomas, a year or two later, and then unfortunately Alan himself dies in the Black Death, which sweeps England in 1348-9. We even know the date, on the 3rd of May 1349 he dies.
So what happens after that?
His son is only 15 years old, so his grandfather looks after the manor. It then stays in the family for several generations.
And do we have many details?
Well, not really. We've got names, we've got dates, but not much flesh, really.
So we've got this one moment around the 14th century when we know what's happening to the family, and there's the Black Death and the tragedy and everything, and then after that they fall into a bit of a historical black hole.
That's the case, that's right. And it's really wonderful that the detail does seem to coincide with the building of this complex.
We have some trouble with the solar, but...
Dan and Mick are still looking for timbers to try and date all the buildings. The roof and walls of this barn certainly don't look medieval, but there may be bits inside that are.
Oh, it's dark in here, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah.
Does it look as if we might get anything out of these timbers?
We'll have a look.
I mean, it's not a problem, Dan, that some of these timbers might have been reused. This one here looks got a rebate in it, for example. Is that likely to be a problem in dating the building?
Well, it won't date the building if it's reused. I mean, it would date where it's come out before.
Yeah.
Mick's also curious about the barn foundations. These massive blocks of stone look just like the ones in parts of the hall and gatehouse, so maybe they're part of a medieval building too. After nearly 2 days looking for clues, Berwick thinks he's got enough dates for various bits of the medieval buildings to piece together the story of their construction. Berwick, you reckon this medieval hall was built twice, don't you? That it was built and then it collapsed and then it was built again?
Well, no, Tony. Actually, I don't
You
any
do?
longer.
You told me before lunch.
Well, I've changed my mind. I've now got a theory that reconciles the contradictions in that.
Which is?
Well, Alan de Charlton started building it before he died. He died in the Black Death in 1349.
Yes.
The family's in disarray, not much happens. But eventually, perhaps 40, perhaps almost 50 years later, they pick it up again and they complete the job. They complete the job finally with putting on that fancy roof, bits of which we found in 1400.
That's incredibly vivid and incredibly plausible, but I know you. If you've just said that, you'll completely change your mind by first thing tomorrow.
I don't think so. I'm going to go and look at some of those detail points again tomorrow, just to convince myself, and then I'll convince you later tomorrow morning.
Dan hasn't had much luck with the roof timbers in the Great Hall, but the beams from the solar date from around 1470. Unless the building took 120 years to finish, they must be part of a later refurbished floor. As for the results from the barn, we'll have to wait till tomorrow. Typical time team, we gave ourselves the task of dating this wonderful medieval building, and then we spend the whole day poking around in the rain looking out at medieval pigsties and outside toilets.
Victorian pigsties, actually, Tony.
Well, that's even worse, isn't it? Not even medieval. I must say that Berwick gets the Medal of Honour today, because at least he's come up with an interesting medieval theory. So, Mick, what are we going to do tomorrow to try and knock it on, to try and establish more about the dating of this building?
Well, I've been line burning a lot of today, and it looked great from the air, mind you, but I haven't had a chance to catch up with the rest of the developments yet.
Then that's not a great deal of help, is it? Carenza, how about you?
Well, I'm the one who's after the medieval loo and the drains, and we're still hopeful we will find them, but as yet we need more work. But Phil's Trent's looking good.
I'm looking really positive. I mean, true, I've got yet another brick floor, but I'm pretty hopeful that when we get that up, we're going to get medieval deposits underneath.
Paul, what about in here?
Well, all the cleaning's showing up a lot of medieval architectural features, which Berwick can have a good look at tomorrow. And I'm still hopeful we might get some medieval floor levels in here.
Great. I must say, all day, I've seen that big trench covered in those infuriating red bricks.
They're protecting it. They may be protecting our most important medieval deposits.
Yeah, well, let's hope they don't have to protect it tomorrow. Let's rip the damn things up. Tomorrow we will rip up the red bricks and hope there's something medieval underneath. See you after the break. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.
Beginning of day 3, and as you can see, we're all hard at work. Ian, why am I dressed like this?
You might well ask. We're going to be unloading the lime kiln, and the lime that's in there is still hot from last night, and it's also caustic, so it's very important that we wear protective clothing. If we take the sheet of tin off the top, with our first glance of what's happened overnight, what we're looking for are those that are very light in colour, and also
like these here, look, which are
that's right,
much lighter,
and also feel nice and feel lighter in weight.
Well, these still feel very heavy, the top ones. Is this yellow a clue? Because they're noticeably more yellow than the...
Yes, it is.
The
It
grey of
started
the
off this
stone.
very grey colour,
Yeah.
and it's changed to a yellow, a dirty white.
Apparently it's called quicklime because the chemical reaction is so violent, which is why we need the goggles.
This is just water straight from the stream.
Oh, crikey, look at this, Tony. It's falling to bits, isn't it?
Well, I'm glad Mick's impressed. It's hard to believe we're going to get lime mortar from this by the end of the day. In the inner courtyard, we've got one last chance to find the garderobe foundations beneath these cobbles. And we've finally managed to rip up the brick floor of our Victorian shed.
Phil!
Hey. Yeah!
I've got your watercolour. Why do you want this?
Well, we've got your bricks off for you.
Yes!
We've got another floor surface. But I think that this floor is the one that the Reverend Williams would have seen when he painted this picture in 1789. Here, grab hold of that, Mick.
Oh, great. Yet another floor to dig through before we get to the medieval.
Look, we've got a culvert in there.
Oh, right. So what sort of date are we thinking of for that then? Or are you thinking of a date at all?
I think it's got to be medieval of some sort. The mortar is very, very similar to what goes on in the hall.
I mean, it doesn't look wide enough to have had a full wall to a good height. It perhaps had a timber-framed structure on the top, perhaps.
It certainly, in its later life, we can see how tall it was because of the imprint in the end wall of the hall there.
Yeah, you can actually see. We need a stick, Tony. So here we are. Makeshift stick. You see this white lime plaster on here?
Yeah.
Well, you see it stops at a
goes up
line
there and
that's...
it goes up
Oh,
to
I
a
see,
point.
It's actually a V shape.
And look here, Tony, is where the roof timbers went in.
There and there, look.
Yeah.
And we think it probably had a lean-to roof on here, look. Right down to there.
It's all still here in bits and bobs on the side of the building.
There's a bit of me saying, why do we care? I mean, I can understand why we can get so excited about this big building here, but basically what we're looking at is a kind of pretty rough old cow shed.
It's what people have been doing on the site, Tony. You know, you can't draw lines around archaeology and say this bit is important because it's ever so old or it's a very high status building.
I mean, we may not be able to get any dating out the ground for this building, but if we can sort that one out, and then we work out what the relationship with that one is with this one, even if the relationship's up there, it still might give us the clue. So, you know, they're all little clues that we've got to put together.
Are you convinced now?
Nearly.
We'd hoped to get more medieval remains in this trench than one drain and half a jug handle, but elsewhere in the main courtyard we have found what we were looking for.
Of the cross range.
Can I ask you about the Oriel? Because on the first day, one of the first questions we set ourselves was, can we date the Oriel? Have we got anywhere on that?
Well, we've excavated its foundations and we found a massive stone raft which would have carried it. So we know it was there. We also know that that stone raft goes with the primary construction of the building.
So does that mean that we can date the Oriel because its foundations are part of the first phase of the building?
Well, yes and no. We don't necessarily know it was constructed to full height. So they may not have got round to do the windows, the fenestration, for example.
It might have been part of this Black Death hiatus.
Absolutely.
So Can we hazard a guess at what it looked like? Presumably, all we can say is either or. It looked like one thing if it was with the first phase and another thing in
That's
the
right.
second
We've got to
phase.
present two options, and the two options are fairly straightforward. If it had been that early phase, then it'll be a small window, but much the same sort of style as that. These oriels are quite young as ideas, and they just really mean a lobby in that the Lord went through on his way up into his chamber. But if, however, it comes in that second phase, then we could expect a larger window in that more modern style, and that'll be a window that'll look something like that. Very much larger, very much grander.
And what does oriel mean?
Well, oriel seems to mean a building that stuck out a bit, like your ear.
Oriel.
Oriel, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yesterday, when Mick and Mark argued about where to put the trench in front of the Gatehouse, I thought they'd agreed to follow the line of the geophysics results. But this trench is nowhere near it.
Now, what's going on here, Mark? When we last talked about this trench, we were looking at geophysics over here, where we talked about putting a trench across there, and then we argued about this poor bloke's garden and the path. When I was up in the helicopter, you've dug it in an L shape.
Well, it seemed a good idea at the time, really. When we argued, we wanted to get the relationship from the medieval gatehouse through into whatever anomaly there might be.
We agreed that we might extend it a bit.
Might extend it a bit,
Yeah.
So I thought it would be easier to put the trench across the anomaly rather than along the anomaly, as you originally suggested.
But the anomaly's further over. If you look on the map, it doesn't start till further up. If you look at the geophysics, there's the door over there. There's the edge of what we thought might be a moat. And then there's a gap, and then the anomaly starts over there where the pole is. John drew that anomaly in.
Yes, I drew that deliberately because this is in an area of confusion. You're in the middle of where the old field boundary is.
So it looks as if we've actually put the trench in, more or less between the two anomalies that we were looking for.
We've come pretty well to the end of it here.
Well, not according to our measurements.
4 metres short.
Yeah, you've gone right through the middle.
Oh dear.
Well, we're not going to resolve either of those things now unless we dig yet another trench across this guy's garden.
Well, we said we were going to do it yesterday.
Right, and across there. And honestly, I don't think we've got time to do that. I mean, if you come back another time and do it, that's fine.
The foundation stone which Mark uncovered yesterday in front of the Gatehouse turns out to be modern concrete underpinning. The only finds are bits of 18th and 19th century pottery. But this trench has proved that there wasn't a medieval moat here, so I suppose we've got something out of it.
I'll dig my own trench next time.
The quicklime's boiling purely with the heat of the chemical reaction. The gravel for our mortar is probably from the same stream as the medieval masons used. Not all the rocks have dissolved, but we've got more than enough good sticky lime mortar. It's mid-afternoon on day 3 and Carenza's just called me round to the inner courtyard.
Can I come on your trench?
Stop that. Remember the cobble floor?
Yes.
Saw this morning. We've taken that off, looking for the guardrail pit. All we found was that post hole by your feet.
Yes.
You can see it just with a bit of wood in it. And we didn't seem to have anything. All we'd got was this green stone here that was dipping away and covered by some reddish clay. And we were sitting there, oh no, God, this is it. We haven't found it. And then we thought, well, there's brick in it. We might as well take it off. And we found, we couldn't have found anything better. We found this very sharp cut from the edge of this green, which was filled with this red clay. Really striking contrast, and you can see what we've got, this sharp vertical edged slot. This isn't a drain, there's no sign of water washing. It's got stone packing at the bottom. This is a foundation trench for a beam, which would be the foundation of a wooden building. You can see it's coming along here, and then there's a right angle turn in it running towards the stone wall at exactly the point where there's a change from that stone wall to the brick wall in the standing building. This seems to be our garderobe. But it's fantastic, it's what we were hoping to find.
The garderobe was built against the outer wall of the solar. The wall may have extended to form an entrance archway to the inner courtyard, so in about 1350, the whole building probably looked like this. Stuart's had a good weekend, finding the water system and tying it all in with the medieval buildings.
Yes, Stuart.
This is the manor here.
Yeah.
There's the hall,
Yeah.
there's the gatehouse, and there's the church.
Yeah.
Looked at the water
Oh,
management
look at that.
aspects of it and what else is going on. We've got fish ponds out here.
Yeah, yeah.
They're supplying fish, an important dietary element to the manor
Yeah.
over here by water management. This thing that everybody was thinking was a moat that I was getting very suspicious about looks to be now ponds.
Yeah, for a garden or something.
That's right,
yeah.
decoration. So we're getting a wider picture outside the manor, and we've got a date from the gatehouse. The fish pond, the village could all have been there at that period,
In the
supporting
14th
the manor.
century. Yeah, very good.
So the water for the culvert came from a diverted spring, which then flowed through the courtyard, past the garderobe and into the terraced gardens below.
Yesterday you came up with this grand theory that this building was created in 2 phases, but with the Black Death in between. Do you still cling to that?
I do, yes. Look over here. This is the great solar block. It's all built of what I call green stone.
Sort of grey green.
Grey green,
Yeah.
and big blocks of it.
Yeah.
But if you scan across to here, most of the hall range is of a rather
It's very pinky,
rough,
isn't it? Yeah.
pinky brown ironstone.
Yeah.
Quite different. And then there are windows that are different in the 2 halves. The great window into the solar is a very handsome job. This is Victor's drawing of
Also,
it.
it's 4 panes.
It has, that's right. And then this central mullion divides it at the top into 2, and each has a trefoil head, that's like a clover leaf. And a window just like that would date from the first half of the 14th century.
Yeah.
But if we go inside, we'll see a window in the other part, the part with all this brown stonework,
Yeah.
that must be, I guess, getting on for 100 years later. And that's it, the one over there. It's blocked with brick, but it's the same trefoil heads. But above the trefoil heads, there's a little bar going up, and that makes the difference. That sort of window has to be a good deal later. So those windows are very different in date. But equally, there are windows around the building that are identical in date. That one, for example, up there, that long, tall one with a flat top and a high bar running across it, is identical to the one you'll have seen in the solar.
Yes, yes.
And those are in these 2 separate parts of the building. And all these dressed parts, that's the window frames and the door frames, have a mason's mark on them, the mark of the man who cut them. And it's the same man, a man who puts a Z on his work, right the way through the building.
So are you saying that Mr. Z made all these parts?
He did,
Stacked
yes.
them up. Some of them went in straight away, and the rest were left lying in the garden and were used sometime later after the Black Death?
That's right, yes. And he made all the difficult bits of the building, but he'd only built the solar end before the Black Death caught the family. And then they picked up the thing 50 years later. They went to the yard where all the stuff was stacked and safely stored, and they started building again. The one thing they didn't do the same, of course, was to use that green stone. They went to a different quarry and used the brown stone instead. And it was all going to be rendered over, so it didn't make much difference.
So is this the authentic way of doing it then, Ian?
This is pretty close to the authentic way. We've got all local materials, and it seems to match almost exactly the mortar that we've taken out of the building.
Yeah. And is this the same sort of stuff that really goes back to Roman times?
It hasn't really significantly changed since Roman times. The Romans really developed the technology and were masters of lime mortar.
Yeah.
And this is pretty similar stuff.
There's a big stone there, look. So would the whole building have looked like this then?
It would have had this very, very thin, smooth render over the whole surface.
Yeah.
But these green sandstone coins wouldn't have been covered with render.
The big blocks up the corner.
The big blocks up the corner and the dressings around the windows would have been unrendered, but all of this rough rubble work in between would have been rendered. So their initial purpose was really to make it look good.
Finally, the entire wall would have been coated in a lime wash made from the same mix as the mortar, so it would have ended up looking like this.
It's 7:45 on our final day, and we've got to stop pretty soon because apart from everything else, everyone's got to get back to their work and their universities and whatever tomorrow. But we've hit this crisis. It's exciting, but it's a crisis anyway. We've got some strange shadowy feature just starting there, going through there. where you're digging, Phil, yeah?
I am indeed.
And over here, then it disappears under this building, i.e. it's older than medieval, and we see it reappearing here in this dark shadow along there, and we don't know what it is, but it's big. And at the same time, we've already discovered this beam slot here. Now, we reckon that just about here there is a doorway. Now, we're guessing that the doorway would have been halfway through this house, if it was a house, which would mean that theoretically we ought to find another parallel beam slot here. But we've got to dig it in order to find out, and we've no time left.
And despite frantic efforts by the whole team, including my own high-class shovelling technique, that was all we found of an earlier building. The beam slot running down the side of the courtyard turned out to be a Victorian drain. But we do know what we came to find out. Just how did Aston Eyre develop from the 14th century onwards? The dates for the Gatehouse timbers were between 1341 and 1352, when Alan de Charlton was married to Marjorie Fitz-Eyre. The 15th century roof beam and window in the hall fit Berwick's theory that it was finished off over 50 years after the Gatehouse. The barn timbers dated from 1612, but the massive stone foundations could have belonged to a medieval building. The story of Aston Eyre is one of continuous alteration through 6 centuries. After 3 days here, I'm wondering if it ever got finished at all. Perhaps Neil Dalton will rebuild it, but if he doesn't, he'll be continuing a long and fascinating tradition.